They told me some things are worse than bad water, but I didn't listen. Now the old well I uncovered on my farm is trying to get out. The air in Oakhaven hangs thick and heavy, like a damp wool blanket you can't quite shrug off. It's a place that time, progress, and decent cell service seem to have forgotten. I inherited my grandfather's farm 6 months ago, a ramshackle collection of buildings huddled together on 50 acres of stubborn, rocky soil. My plan was simple: fix the place up, sell it, and use the money to escape my soul-crushing tech job in the city. I pictured a few months of honest, hard work, breathing in fresh country air and getting my hands dirty. I was an idiot. The farmhouse itself was a battle of wills. Every floorboard creaked with a different complaint, and the windows rattled with the ghosts of 100 forgotten winters. But the real challenge was the land. Grandad Joseph hadn't been a farmer so much as a curator of weeds and overgrowth. I spent weeks with a scythe and a brush cutter, wrestling back a jungle of thorny vines and defiant saplings from the main yard. It was during this brutal campaign that I found it. My boot struck something hard, something that wasn't a rock. I kicked away a thick mat of ivy and moss to reveal a perfect circle of weathered gray stone about 4 feet across. Set in the center was a heavy, circular iron lid, pitted with rust, and held down by a thick, archaic-looking hasp. It was a well. An old one, clearly sealed for a very long time. My first thought was practical. A well could be a huge asset. If the water was clean, it could add thousands to the property value. If it was dry, I'd have to fill it in for safety. Either way, I needed to know what I was dealing with. But something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just old, it felt ancient and deliberately forgotten. The stones were fitted together with a precision that seemed out of place with the rest of the farm's haphazard construction, and the iron lid looked more like the door to a vault than a simple well cover. That evening, I went into the village for supplies. Oakhaven has one pub, the Crooked Shepherd, where the same dozen old-timers have been nursing the same pints of bitter since the dawn of time. I sat at the bar and, trying to sound casual, mentioned my discovery. A sudden, profound silence fell over the room. It was so complete that I could hear the buzz of the ancient beer cooler behind the bar. The bartender, a burly man named George with a face like a crumpled map, stopped polishing a glass and stared at me. "You're Joseph's boy," he stated, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. "Grandson," I corrected. "I'm fixing up the place. Found the old well in the east yard." An old man in the corner, with a face like a dried apple and eyes that seemed to hold the village's entire history, slowly lowered his newspaper. This was Silas. I'd been warned he was the local eccentric, the keeper of old tales. "That well ain't for water," Silas rasped, his voice like stones grinding together. "Your granddad knew that. His father before him knew it. It was sealed for a reason." "What reason?" I asked, forcing a light chuckle. "Bad water? Contamination?" Silas's eyes didn't waver. They were a pale, watery blue, but they pinned me in place. "Some things are worse than bad water, son. Some thirsts shouldn't be quenched. You leave it be. You cover it back up with that ivy, and you walk away." The other men mumbled their agreement into their beers, refusing to meet my eyes. The atmosphere was thick with a shared, unspoken fear. I tried to press them for more, but the conversation was over. They turned back to their drinks, pointedly ignoring me. It was like I'd broken a sacred taboo just by saying the word, well. I left the pub feeling unnerved but also stubborn. I'm a man of logic. I believe in physics and biology, not cryptic warnings from old men in pubs. They were indulging in local folklore, trying to spook the city boy. A sealed well was a mystery, and my modern, rational mind couldn't let it go. It was a problem to be solved, a box to be checked on my long to-do list. The next morning, armed with a heavy-duty crowbar, a sledgehammer, and a can of rust penetrant, I went to work. The sun was bright, the birds were singing. It was a perfect day for debunking superstitions. The hasp was rusted solid, fused into the lid by decades of rain and neglect. I drenched it in penetrant and started hammering. The sound was shockingly loud in the morning quiet. Each clang of the hammer on the iron seemed to make the air vibrate. It took the better part of an hour, my arms aching and my shirt soaked with sweat, before the hasp finally groaned and broke apart with a sharp crack. It was done. Now for the lid itself. I jammed the tip of the crowbar into the thin gap between the iron and the stone. I put all my weight into it, my muscles screaming in protest. Nothing. It was as if the lid was sealed by more than just rust. I repositioned the crowbar, found a better angle, and tried again. This time I felt a slight give. A scraping sound, deep and guttural, echoed from the metal. A fine line of black, damp-smelling dirt trickled out. I worked at it relentlessly, leveraging a few inches at a time. The sound of the iron grinding against the stone was like a giant's teeth being pulled. It was a primal, unsettling noise that set my own teeth on edge. With every inch I gained, a puff of cold, stale air would escape from the darkness below. It didn't smell like well water. It smelled of deep, damp earth, of decay, and something else. Something metallic and vaguely unpleasant, like old blood. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I had a gap wide enough to get my fingers under. The iron was cold, shockingly so under the warm sun. I braced my feet, took a deep breath, and heaved. The lid, with a final, soul-shaking shriek of tortured metal, slid sideways and crashed onto the grass beside the well, with a deafening thud that shook the ground. Silence. The birds had stopped singing. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. I stood there for a moment, heart hammering against my ribs, and then cautiously leaned over the edge. I expected to see the glint of water far below, or maybe just the dry, packed earth of a failed well. I saw neither. All I saw was a perfect, impenetrable blackness. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was a heavy, suffocating darkness that seemed to swallow the sunlight pouring into it. The cold air rising from it was now a steady, chilling plume. And then I heard it. It started as a low vibration, a hum that seemed to travel up through the stone and into the soles of my feet. It grew slowly, resolving itself into a sound. It wasn't the gurgle of water or the skittering of an animal. It was a voice, a low, guttural, wet-sounding moan that began to rise in pitch and volume from the inky depths. It climbed and climbed, twisting from a sound of sorrow into something else entirely. It became a shriek, a high, thin, piercing scream of pure, undiluted malice that scraped its way up the stone throat of the well and clawed at the inside of my skull. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. I threw myself backwards, scrambling away on my hands and heels, kicking up dirt and loose stones. My breath came in ragged, painful bursts. The scream didn't just end. It was cut off, as if a door had been slammed shut on it deep within the earth, leaving a ringing, absolute silence in its wake. My ears throbbed. The world seemed to tilt on its axes, the familiar green of the grass and the solid blue of the sky suddenly feeling like a fragile painted backdrop for the horrible reality that now gaped open in my yard. I didn't stop scrambling until my back hit the rough-hewn siding of the old barn, a good 50 feet away. My heart was a wild animal trying to batter its way out of my chest. My mind raced, desperately trying to find a peg of logic to hang this on. An animal. It had to be a fox or a bobcat, fallen in and trapped. Their cries could be terrifyingly human-like. But that explanation felt hollow, a lie I was telling myself. The sound hadn't been one of pain or fear. It was a scream of triumph, of hate, and it had felt ancient, a sound that had been waiting in that darkness for a very, very long time. I stayed there, pressed against the barn, for what felt like hours, watching the well. The heavy iron lid lay on the grass like a fallen monument. The well itself was just a black circle, a wound in the earth. The sun was high and bright, but its light seemed to bend around the opening, refusing to penetrate the darkness within. It was a patch of perpetual night, and the longer I looked at it, the more I felt like it was looking back. I couldn't leave it open. The thought of that void being accessible, of that thing being free to scream again, or worse, was unbearable. But the thought of getting close to it again sent a wave of nausea through me. I spent the rest of the day in a state of high alert, jumping at every creak of the old house, every rustle in the trees. I tried to work, to fix a leaky faucet in the kitchen, but my hands shook too badly. My eyes kept being drawn to the window that overlooked the east yard, to the well. By late afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. The stubborn, rational part of my brain was losing its war against the primal terror that had taken root in my gut. Silas. The old man in the pub. Some things are worse than bad water. He knew what was down there. I had to go back. I had to beg him to tell me what I had done. I practically ran to my truck, not even bothering to lock the farmhouse door. I just needed to get away from the property, away from that gaping black mouth in the yard. The drive into Oakhaven was a blur. When I burst into the Crooked Shepherd, the same group of old-timers were in their usual spots. The place fell silent again, but this time it wasn't a silence of suspicion. It was a heavy, knowing silence of pity. George the bartender just pointed with his chin towards the back corner. Silas was there, nursing a small glass of something dark. He didn't look surprised to see me. He just watched me approach with those pale, watery eyes. "You opened it," he said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. It wasn't a question. I collapsed into the chair opposite him, my hands trembling so badly I had to clench them into fists on the tabletop. "What was that sound?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. "What is in that well?" Silas took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving mine. "You city folk," he sighed, a deep, weary sound. "You come out here with your plans and your logic. You think the world is a simple machine, that if you just pull the right levers, it all makes sense. But this place is old. The ground here remembers things, things that your science and your reason have forgotten how to name. Please," I begged, all my city-bred pride gone. "You have to tell me." He leaned forward, the smell of whiskey and old wool wafting from him. "That ain't a well for water, son. It's a prison, a cage. Dug a long, long time ago by people who knew how to handle such things. They trapped something down there, something hungry." "Hungry for what?" "For us," he said simply. "For life, for attention. It can't get out, not physically. The stones are marked, the iron was blessed, but it can call. It whispers. It finds the cracks in your mind, the little fears and sorrows you carry, and it feeds on them. It promises things. My great-grandfather heard it calling his wife's name after she passed. He almost went down there to join her. It drove him mad. A cold dread, far deeper than the initial shock of the scream, settled into my bones. This was worse than a monster. This was a predator of the mind. "The scream," I started. "It's happy," Silas interrupted, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You broke the seal. You let the daylight and the fresh air in. You woke it up properly. It's been sleeping for a long time, just dreaming. Now it's awake, and it knows you're there. It knows your name." My blood ran cold. How could it know my name? It listens. It learns. Your granddad, Joseph, he knew. He heard it sometimes. Faint whispers on the wind when the weather was turning. That's why he never went near that part of the yard. Why he told us all to stay away. He let the ivy grow over it, hoping it would be forgotten forever. Silas drained his glass. "You didn't just open a well, boy. You rang the dinner bell." I sat there paralyzed. The whole world had been turned upside down. Folklore was real. The monster under the bed was real, and it was living in my backyard. "What do I do?" I finally managed to ask. Can I seal it again?" Silas shook his head slowly. "Not so simple. The old magic is gone. The words of sealing are lost, and now that it's had a taste of the open air, it's stronger. It won't be so easy to ignore. It will start to play games with you." I drove back to the farm as dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of orange and purple that seemed sinister and mocking. Every shadow on the side of the road looked like a crouching figure. The woods felt alive, watching me. When I pulled into my driveway, the farmhouse stood dark and silent, and in the twilight I could see it, the perfect black circle of the well, an open eye in the fading light. My plan was to get a heavy tarp from the barn, cover the opening, and weigh it down with the biggest rocks I could find. It was a flimsy, pathetic solution, but it was all I could think of. I just couldn't stand the thought of it being open to the night sky. As I got out of my truck, a flicker of movement near the well caught my eye. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. But there was nothing there, just the long shadows of the evening. Shaking, I told myself it was just my frayed nerves. I walked towards the house, my keys clutched in my sweaty palm, my gaze fixed on that dark circle. And that's when I saw it. Resting on the stone rim of the well, placed perfectly in the center of the edge closest to the house, was a small rectangular object. It was a framed photograph. My stomach dropped. I recognized it instantly. It was the silver-framed photo of my parents that I kept on the mantelpiece inside the house I had left unlocked in my haste. My mind refused to process it. How? I walked forward as if in a trance, my feet crunching on the gravel. The photo was placed face down. With a hand that shook so violently I could barely control it, I reached out and turned it over. The glass was cold and damp. Underneath it, my parents smiled back at me from a sunny beach vacation years ago. But something was horribly wrong. 2 jagged, violent scratches had been gouged across the photograph, right over their faces, completely obliterating their eyes and mouths, leaving nothing but 2 grotesque, smiling voids. I dropped the frame as if it were burning hot. It landed with a soft thud on the grass, the defaced image of my parents staring up at the darkening sky. A wave of ice-cold violation washed over me. It had been in my house. The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. That thing, that voice, had somehow reached out from its prison of stone and earth, crossed my yard, slipped through my unlocked door, and touched my most personal belongings. It hadn't just taken the photo. It had chosen it. It had desecrated it. This wasn't a random act. It was a message, a threat. I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on the well, then spun around and sprinted for the house. I burst through the door, slamming and bolting it behind me, my heart jackhammering against my ribs. I flicked on every light switch I could find, flooding the small rooms with a harsh, sterile glare that did little to chase away the encroaching dread. The living room was exactly as I'd left it, except for the empty space on the mantelpiece. A small rectangle of dust outlined where the photo had been. Nothing else was disturbed. No muddy footprints, no broken windows. It was as if a ghost had drifted through the walls. Sleep was impossible. I sat in a hard-backed kitchen chair all night, a heavy fireplace poker clutched in my white-knuckled grip, my back to the wall. I watched the windows expecting to see a face peering in, or a shadow moving where it shouldn't. But there was nothing. The only sounds were the groans of the old house settling, and the frantic thumping of my own pulse in my ears. The silence was worse than the scream had been. The scream was an outburst, an explosion of malice. The silence was a coiled snake, waiting. It was the silence of a predator that knows it has all the time in the world. And then the whispers started. It wasn't a sound that came through the windows. It was inside my head, faint at first, like a radio tuned just off station, a staticky murmur at the very edge of hearing. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was exhaustion, my mind playing tricks on me. But it grew clearer. It was a soft, sibilant voice, and it was shaping itself into words I almost understood. It wasn't speaking English, not exactly. It was a collage of sounds, mimicking the rhythm and cadence of speech. It used the memory of voices I knew, a fragment of my mother's laugh, twisted into a question, the gruff cadence of my grandfather's voice smoothed into a soothing lie. Come closer. Just a look. We miss you. The words weren't clear, but the intent was. It was a lure. It was baiting me, trying to coax me back outside. It was a fisherman's line cast into the dark waters of my mind, and I could feel the hook scraping against my deepest fears and longings. The loneliness I'd felt since my parents passed. The grief for the grandfather I barely knew. The crushing weight of my own failures. It found every raw nerve and plucked at it with cold, deliberate fingers. I spent the next 2 days as a prisoner in my own home. I boarded up the window that faced the well, nailing thick planks of scrap wood over the glass. I blocked the doors with furniture. I ate cold food out of cans because I was too terrified to stand by the stove with my back to the room. The whispers were constant now, a maddening background hum to my existence. They would rise and fall, sometimes fading to almost nothing, only to surge back when my guard was down. At night they were worst. They would weave themselves into my dreams, turning memories into nightmares. I saw my parents again, standing on that sunny beach, but when they turned to me, their faces were the scratched-out voids from the photograph, and they were beckoning me into the dark, churning ocean. On the third day, the water in the house stopped working. I turned the tap in the kitchen and got nothing but a cough of air and a spurt of rusty sludge. I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that this was not a simple plumbing issue. The farmhouse got its water from an electric pump connected to a modern, drilled well a few hundred yards on the other side of the house. I checked it myself when I first moved in. It was a separate system, completely unconnected to the old stone well. But it didn't matter. It knew. It was cutting me off, isolating me further. Desperate, I tried my cell phone, but there was no signal. There never was much of one out here, but now it was completely dead. The landline was the same, a dead, hollow silence when I lifted the receiver. It was toying with me, tightening the net. By the fourth day, I was running out of bottled water. Thirst became a gnawing, physical torment that overshadowed even the fear. I knew I couldn't stay inside forever. I would have to go out. I would have to go to the pump house. To do that, I would have to cross the yard in full view of the well. The thought made my stomach clench. I spent hours psyching myself up, pacing the confines of my small, boarded-up world. The whispers grew more insistent, more seductive. So thirsty. There's water here. Deep, cool water. Just a sip. Finally, driven by a desperate animal need, I grabbed the heavy poker and slowly unblocked the back door. The afternoon sun was blindingly bright. I squinted, my eyes watering. The yard was quiet. The birds were singing again. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves. For a surreal moment, everything looked normal, beautiful even. It was a perfect country afternoon. And then I saw the well. The iron lid was back on. I froze, my hand on the doorknob. It was impossible. The lid weighed at least 200 pounds. I had nearly broken my back just sliding it off. There was no way it could have been moved back into place without a machine or several strong men. It was sitting perfectly centered, as if it had never been disturbed. The broken hasp lay on the grass beside it, a mute testament to my folly. My mind reeled. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was I going mad from the isolation and stress? For a wild, hopeful second, I almost believed it. Maybe Silas and the old men had just been spinning tales. Maybe the scream was an echo, a trick of the wind. Maybe I'd dropped the photograph myself and hadn't realized. Slowly, cautiously, I stepped out into the yard. I walked towards the well, my poker held out in front of me like a talisman. The air grew colder as I approached. The smell was still there, damp earth and old decay. I reached the stone circle and looked down. The lid was solid, immovable. It was sealed. Relief washed over me, so potent it made me dizzy. It was over. Whatever it was contained again. I felt foolish, weak. I was a city boy spooked by country ghost stories. I let out a shaky laugh, the sound thin and strange in the quiet air. I turned my back on the well and started towards the pump house on the far side of the lawn, my thirst now an urgent, demanding force. I had taken maybe 10 steps when I heard it. A faint scratching sound. I stopped dead. It was coming from the well. I turned around slowly. The scratching continued, a dry, rhythmic sound. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was the sound of something sharp, like a fingernail or a shard of rock, being dragged across the underside of the heavy iron lid from within. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't sealed in. I had sealed myself out with it. The scratching stopped. A muffled, wet thud echoed from beneath the iron, as if something heavy and soft had been thrown against it. Then another, and another. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was getting stronger, louder, more frantic. The heavy iron lid, all 200 pounds of it, began to vibrate. It lifted a fraction of an inch on one side with a horrible grinding noise, then slammed back down. A puff of foul-smelling dust shot out from the crack. Thump, thump, thump. It was trying to get out. It was coming out. And then from the tiny gap between the lid and the stone, a thin, black, tar-like substance began to ooze out, glistening slickly in the afternoon sun. It wasn't water. It was thick, viscous, and it moved with a horrifying, unnatural purpose, like a slug of pure darkness probing the world of light. The black ooze pulsed with the thuds from below, a grotesque-looking secretion that seemed to defy gravity, clinging to the stone before dripping in thick, slow tears onto the grass. The sight broke my paralysis. This wasn't a game of whispers and psychological torment anymore. This was physical. This was an escape. My thirst, my fear, my rational mind, it all collapsed into a single, primal instinct. Survival. I wasn't going to die here. I wasn't going to be the village cautionary tale for the next generation of city boys. Grandad Joseph hadn't just ignored the well. He had left a farm full of tools. He had left an arsenal. I turned and ran, not towards the house, but towards the big, dilapidated barn. The one place on this property that felt more like a fortress than a cage. The heavy doors groaned as I heaved them open, spilling dusty shafts of light into the cavernous interior. The air smelled of old hay, engine oil, and time. My eyes scanned the cluttered space, past the rusted tractor and piles of rotting lumber, searching for anything that could help. The thudding from the well was a constant, terrifying drumbeat now, the rhythm of my impending doom. I could hear it clearly even from inside the barn. Thump-crack, thump-crack. The sound of the lid lifting and slamming down was getting louder, more violent. My gaze landed on a row of old fuel cans in the corner. Red metal cans, heavy and full. Kerosene for the old lamps, gasoline for the tractor. An idea, born of sheer, adrenaline-fueled desperation, exploded in my mind. It was insane. It was dangerous. It was all I had. I grabbed the largest can of gasoline, the metal cold and solid in my trembling hands. I sloshed it, nearly full. Then I saw it, hanging on a rusty nail on the wall, a long-necked funnel, and next to it a box of waterproof matches. My plan was simple and suicidal. Silas had said the thing couldn't get out physically, that the stones were marked. But I had broken the seal. I had given it an opening, and it was clearly exploiting it. Maybe the old magic was failing, but fire was a magic all its own. It was a cleanser, a sterilizer. With the heavy can in one hand and the poker in the other, I ran from the barn. The scene at the well was worse than I could have imagined. The black ooze was now a small, sluggish pool around the base, and the grass it touched was withering and turning black, as if burned by acid. The iron lid was rocking violently, lifting a full inch with every impact, revealing a sliver of the absolute darkness within, before crashing down again. The whispers in my head had become a chaotic symphony of rage and pleading. "Let me out! I can give you everything. Don't! You'll burn with me!" It knew what I was planning. It could feel my intent. I didn't hesitate. I jammed the tip of the fireplace poker under the edge of the rocking lid. As it lifted again from another blow from below, I heaved with all my strength, using the poker as a lever. The lid tilted, balancing precariously on the stone edge for a terrifying second. From the opened gap, a wave of impossible cold and the stench of an open grave washed over me, so potent it made me gag. For a fraction of a second, I thought I saw something in the darkness. Not a shape, but a distortion. A patch of blackness that was somehow blacker than the rest. With a final, desperate shove, the lid toppled over and crashed to the ground. The well was open. The thudding stopped instantly. A profound, expectant silence fell. The whispers ceased. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I jammed the funnel into the neck of the gasoline can and just started pouring. I drenched the stone rim, the blackened grass, the pool of disgusting ooze. Then, aiming for the center of that black hole, I upended the can. A torrent of gasoline cascaded into the depths, the sound of it splashing against the unseen walls echoing up like a hideous mockery of a waterfall. I threw the empty can aside, grabbed the box of matches, and fumbled one out. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to strike it. The small flame flickered to life, a tiny, defiant spear of light against the encroaching dread. A new sound began to rise from the well. Not a scream, but a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the ground. It was a sound of pure, unrestrained fury. The whispers returned. A single, concentrated thought blasted into my mind. A psychic shriek of negation. No, I didn't listen. I tossed the match. It seemed to fall in slow motion, a tiny star tumbling into a black universe. The moment it hit the gasoline-soaked rim, the world erupted. A deafening whoomp of sound and pressure threw me backward. A column of roiling orange flame shot 30 feet into the air, a greasy black smoke pouring from its heart. The heat was immense, searing my face and hands even from a distance, and from within that inferno the scream began. It was the same sound I had heard before, but 1,000 times worse. It was no longer a sound of malice or triumph. It was a shriek of unimaginable agony. It wasn't the sound of something physical burning. It was the sound of a soul being scoured, of a mind being torn apart by a fire it was never meant to feel. The scream tore through the air, inhuman and eternal, a sound that etched itself permanently onto my memory. I scrambled away, shielding my face from the heat, my eyes fixed on the pillar of fire. The scream went on and on, never wavering, never needing to draw breath. It was a sound that belonged in hell, and I had just brought a piece of hell to my grandfather's farm. I don't know how long it burned. It felt like an eternity. The flames gradually subsided, the roaring inferno shrinking back down the throat of the well. The scream faded with it, sinking back into the earth, until finally there was only the flickering orange glow deep within the stone circle, and the hiss of superheated rock. The air was thick with the smell of burnt gasoline and something else. Something foul and unholy, like scorched meat and ozone. I stood there for a long time, watching the last of the flames die out until the well was once again just a black hole, now ringed with scorched blackened stone. It was quiet. The whispers were gone. The oppressive feeling of being watched had vanished. The air felt clean, light. For the first time in days, I felt alone. Truly alone. The next day, I hired a cement truck from the next town over. I didn't explain why. I just paid the man double in cash to back up to the east yard and dump his entire load down the old well. We watched as tons of wet, gray concrete poured into the darkness, filling it, consuming it, until the hole was gone, replaced by a solid, impenetrable plug of stone that rose a foot above the ground. When it was done, I took a sledgehammer and smashed the old iron lid into a dozen jagged pieces. I never fixed the rest of the farm. I sold the land to a developer a week later for a fraction of what it was worth, with a single, non-negotiable clause in the contract. The concrete slab in the east yard was never to be disturbed. I took the money, packed a single bag, and left Oakhaven without looking back. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is too quiet, I can almost hear it. A faint, staticky whisper at the edge of hearing. And sometimes in my dreams I see a perfect circle of scorched stone under a gray country sky. But the scream is silent. I buried it under 10 tons of concrete. I buried it in fire and stone. I tell myself it's gone forever. But Silas's words still echo in my mind. Some things are worse than bad water. And I know, deep in my bones, that some prisons aren't meant to hold their captives forever. They're just meant to hold them for a very, very long time.